Hi guys, I know it's been a while since I rapped at you, as they say on YouTube and whatnot, but I got some stuff for you tonight. I need to get this down somewhere. I don't really want to do a whole episode about it, but I really want to get it off my chest. Um, Hopefully, we're going to cut this off of Periscope and put it on YouTube next. And I want to kind of think of this as a supplement to the fascism solo episode I did last month. I was really happy with the response I got, and it was really heartening to see that people understood what I was saying and thought it was compelling. But upon re-listening to it, I kind of realized that I kind of gave the subject short shrift in that I really only focused on one aspect of fascism, specifically fascism as viewed from the commanding height of capital, right? I was basically saying, what does capitalism see in fascism, right? Like, why did capitalists back fascism? Why did they allow the governments to become fascist and then cooperate with fascists? And like the mechanisms it used to control, like I said, using colonial enforcement inside the country itself. But I realized that kind of left a couple of very important questions off the table that I forgot about. I'm very sorry about this. But the main one is I wanted to talk about fascism's social base. Like, we talked about why capital wanted it, but we didn't really talk about who made up the actual movement. And that's very important. There's another thing we'll talk about later too, but that's the main one I wanted to point out. So I mentioned briefly, and I really wish I'd used that as an opportunity to start talking about that. In the last episode about this, I talked about the Freikorps, right? These are the demobilized World War I veterans who had basically lost their humanity in many important ways on the battlefields of the Western and Eastern fronts. War was the only world they knew. It was the only world they wanted. They were repulsed by the hypocrisies and fake civilization of the rest of the world. They wanted the immediacy and truth and honor of battlefield. Ernst Junger was an author who wrote very much about this. The Storm of Steel is his famous book, and it really does talk about how those fucking trenches, they forged a new person who'd never really existed before, because that sort of warfare had never existed before. And exposure to it had created people who were basically no longer able to function in society, people who had been shorn of their human feelings, other than their fascination with death, either dealing it or having it threatened against them. And of course, this wasn't all World War I veterans, but it was these specific ones who joined the Freikorps, which had been created by the Social Democrats, smart move guys, to suppress the Spartacist rebellions and communist insurgencies that racked Germany after World War I. And they did it. They found the most battle-hardened and the most eager young men among the demobilizing veterans to form into these informal militias, go into Berlin, massacre the Spartacists, kill Rosa Luxemburg, go to Munich, kill the people who had the short-lived Munich Soviet. Kill them in Baden, kill them in the Ruhr, killed them everywhere. And they did it. And they even went on a punitive expedition into the Baltics to try to prevent the new Soviet Union from going too far west. They're basically in love with violence. It was the only language I understood at that point. And after the final suppression of the Spartacists, and the Freikorps were once again demobilized, and many of them formed the new groups of sort of street fighters who grew up in the Weimar era political scene. Everybody basically had a party militia. The socialists did, and the communists, of course, did too. There were starting off. There were a bunch of nationalist parties all competing for the patronage of the wealthy and for like the middle class to form their base. And the Nazis started off as just one of the smaller ones actually, but over time they were able, through Hitler's guidance and charisma, to sort of absorb the rest of them. And as they did so, their street militia, the Sturmarbeitung, the SA, became the biggest one. And it was composed largely of these demobilized Freikorps, these guys who had fought in the World War I, come home, fought in the revolution to suppress it, and then didn't want to stop. And so they became part of this street fighting group, the Brown Shirts. And they would fight in the streets with socialists and communists. They would trade political assassinations back and forth. They'd shoot people in the street or break up meetings. And that was like the most militant base. And that's also true in Italy to a lesser. The Black Shirts were largely also World War I veterans who sort of have that taste for violence and kind of can't give it up. But they did, because they took power so quickly, the 1922 versus 1933 for the Nazis, they didn't have as long of a period to sort of express themselves as a militia competing with other militias on the political landscape. So for the whole 20s and 30s, early 30s, you had these guys out there cracking the heads of communists and socialists, and basically recreating the blood and thunder of the Western Front every day. It's actually a fascinating subject. We talked about, how these fascist groups formed, these fascist street fighting groups were largely formed of veterans. Another group of incredibly violent World War I veterans who returned to civilian life, found it unpalatable, and went back to fighting. This in a country that did not succumb to fascism, but rather maintained it did its horrible violence mostly outside of the metropole. It's a country that never experienced the sort of deep crisis point as the others of Europe, and therefore never really went fascist. All of that violence was colonial. So the equivalent of the black shirts and the brown shirts in Europe, in the either defeated or culturally and economically deeply conflicted countries of Germany and Italy, in the UK, when the Anglo-Irish War kicked off and the IRA started shooting cops and blowing bombs up in Ireland, they created an auxiliary military force called the Black and Tans, who rove through Ireland, basically shooting anything they moved. They burned down the city of Cork at one point. They would basically carry out putative retribution raids every time the IRA did an action. And as a result of that, just totally lost the population. Everyone hated them. It's a word that you still spit out of your mouth. There's a classic song, "Come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Show your wives how you won medals down in Flanders." So there was a phenomenon that went throughout the countries that were truly scarred by World War I. But it manifested itself as these fascist street militias in Italy and in Germany. So that's the guys who made up the street element of fascism. And then, of course, at its top levels, you had guys like Ludendorff, who had been the commander of the losing German army during World War I, talked to his dead son in his tent, and provided early behind-the-scenes support for the Nazis. You had guys like the Thule Society, a bunch of crazy, weird, psychopathic occultists who believed in shit like hollow earth and whatnot. And then, mutants and freaks and outcasts, guys like Himmler, like total fuck-ups. The incel Pepes of their day. Like, Himmler was the fucking Pepeist of the fucking Nazis. 100%. But then you had this fighting force of young World War I veterans. So that's the party. But of course, what was more important and what led them to win was the fact that they, by the end of the Weimar period, were the plurality party in Germany. They had, if not they didn't have a majority ever in the Reichstag, but they had the plurality of the seats by the end. So you got to say who is voting for them. So that's a different group. These aren't people who are necessarily in the party. These are people who cast their ballots for them and help give them power. And as I said in the last episode, Nazism or fascism, whatever, is very much a postmodern concept in that it seeks to gain power first and sort of backfill the ideology after that, instead of representing an interest the way traditional parties did. But part of that is that they had an appeal for everybody. They had an appeal to the working class to compete with the communists and the socialists with national German Workers' Party. But then they had National in there for the more middle-class nationalists. They had a Blood and Soil. Remember the soil part of Blood and Soil appeal to sort of a agrarian German past that appealed to the small-holding peasants of Middle Germany. And parenthetically, they weren't the only major party to have that sort of appeal. The Center Party, which was another one of the largest parties in interwar Germany, was also in that corporate mold because it was the explicitly Catholic party. They were a party that was around like Catholic corporatist and distributist ideas. And as a result, it was able to make that cross-class appeal, but it really only extended to the southern German states like Bavaria that were majority Catholic. Whereas Nazism attempted to make that same appeal, but to everybody in Germany. In fact, it was born in Munich, in the heart of Bavaria. That's where the Beer Hall Putsch of 1922 occurred. And that's where the party was founded. But it was never that popular because of the competition from the Center Party. Basically, they had another sort of holistic political concept to offer and compete with the Nazis, but it was limited to the Catholic part. And parenthetically, as much as they were horrified by the Nazis, their votes in the Reichstag confirmed the Enabling Acts, which were the actual legal mechanism that allowed the Nazis to abolish German democracy. They voted for that shit. So you want to fucking talk about never Trumpers or whatever, just parenthetically, but when the ships are down, they'll fucking sign off because it was a party for everybody, but it was a party by the Catholic bourgeois. So they knew where their bread was buttered, and that's where they went with. But anyway, so to a certain extent, they were successful in that. There always was a solid amount of working class Nazi voting, but it was never significant. It was always one of their worst categories. They just couldn't compete with the Social Democrats and the Communists. And in cities that had very, very strong union density, like Hamburg, they weren't even competitive. So that they had a bit of working class support, but the real places of electoral support were the urban petty bourgeois, shopkeepers, clerks, lower class professionals, that sort of thing, and the farmers, the peasantry, the potato sack. And it's easy to see why, because you've got two groups of people who were as devastated by the immediate post-war economic crisis and the hyperinflation, and then later by the Great Depression. Those are the things that softened the ground for the Nazis. Their fortunes went up and down with the economic reality of Germany. They were actually on the verge of irrelevance. They were dwindling before the Great Depression, and then that just brought them into the stratosphere. So they were a party that preyed on that, preyed on crisis, preyed on capitalist crisis to say we will rise as one, and we know who's responsible for this, the Jews and their specific sort of capitalism, not capitalism, not the good capitalism of our good German owners who would never do all those bad things. It's those bad capitalists who are doing it, the Jewish ones. The other ones, they're still good. Please allow them to control all the economy once we get rid of the bad ones. And both these groups, buffeted by harmed badly by the economic crises, but in both cases, their relationship with the capitalist exploitation matrix they found themselves in was indirect. Like, especially if you're a small shopkeeper, you don't see an exploiter above you. If you're part of a firm, like a lower member, part of a firm or a clerk, you might know who your boss is, but you don't have a lot of coworkers to compare notes to and create a common conception of exploitation with, which is how class consciousness is formed. So they couldn't do that. They didn't do that. And they also didn't feel they felt separated from the working class. And similarly in the peasantry, as we've discussed before, the solitary lives of farmers and their distance from their neighbors, and the fact that they don't have bosses in the traditional sense, and they don't feel exploitation in the same way, and they can't compare notes, and they don't spend time together, and they rely on these very sort of skeletal networks of church and like state institutions to maintain any sort of social understanding. In moments of crisis, they're not going to respond to some abstract appeal to a class solidarity they don't know about. They're going to respond to the age-old tropes, the idea that things were better in the past, the idea that there's an alien other in their community, a religious one, that must be expunged. And so that's where the support for the Nazis was electorally, those two groups. That's where they got their biggest margins. And it's easy to see how that happens. The working class, whether they were split tragically between the Social Democrats and the Communists, which helped pave the way for the Nazis to take power. And people want to argue all day about whose fault it was. It genuinely was both of their fault. It was just a tragic escalation of errors on both sides. Bad communication, bad faith, disastrous, genuinely disastrous, like a tragic thing. But either way, they experienced the Great Depression as one more of these titanic battles between them and their bosses, who they all understood to be exploiting them, and who they understood to be not racially bound, but bound by their relationship to capitalism. So that's the social basis of fascism, is the petty bourgeois and the farmer, the rural peasant. And now that brings me to my second point I forgot to make on the last show. And I say that the small bourgeois, the farmer, and then you think about what we've kind of referred to colloquially as the new fascist movement of Trumpism, of MAGA, how that is when that's the Republican Party turning into a fascist blood and soil party and not the traditional reactionary party it had been. It's the same fucking base. It's the suburban fat cat jet ski dealer or insurance agent or Subway franchisee. It's him, and then it's the inhabitants of the great empty places in America, the demographically considered rural neighborhoods, and white ones, of course. So it's the same thing. It's people in the country, and it's then more well-off people in the inner ring suburbs and exurbs. So that's why people think, oh man, this is fascism all over again. And it could be, but there's a crucial difference. And this is something I kind of skipped over last time, and I feel like I've left a wrong impression, honestly. And that is that the specific crisis that fascism is meant to address for capitalism is dealing with a organized left opposition among unions and among organized workers. The idea that the working class is organized along a left agenda. They have political instruments that can carry out that will in the form of political parties and cadre orgs and all that stuff. They can express their will through politics, and the mechanisms of electoralism will allow them to take power. And so fascism is the electoral alternative to that. Also, the street alternative, as we know, so much of political transmission has to do with controlling spaces. So, and feeling like you can operate freely, and that's what the street fighting came in. So that's why fascism was endorsed by capital at that point. We don't live in that world. There is no left in America, or even really the rest of the world. I mean, whatever you want to call, and even if you want to call some things communism or whatever, I might argue with you, but I think we could both agree, for example, on something like China, that even if you think China is still communist or whatever, and I don't want to get into that, you can't argue that they're not exporting it the way that they are not exporting it the way that the Soviet Union did. They're not a conscious ideological alternative to capitalism. They're absolutely happy to operate on the world stage, create spheres of influence, using everybody else's sort of neoliberal logic and market. They're fine with that, to integrate it into their own thing for the aggrandizement of China. So that means there is not a left alternative. The political America, I mean, especially America, but also other places, the political sphere has collapsed. The idea of you being a member of a party, of you having a political identity, the way that people did at the early 20th century, is completely gone. I mean, the Social Democratic Party alone in Germany had an entire parallel cultural existence. They had gyms and taverns and movie theaters and social clubs and mutual aid orgs, a parallel state. Also, even farther later than that, the Communist Party of Italy during the post-war period, after almost taking power at the ballot box in 1948, which, by the way, was defeated with tons of American bribes and a coalition with the mafia to suppress the communists there. And then Operation Gladio helped continue that tradition, and the years of lead and the fucking P2 Lodge, and that's a whole other fucking thing. But it was all to counteract a communist party that had its own separate existence with newspapers and radio stations and TV shows and mayoralties and municipal governances. That doesn't exist. We aren't political the way we were. I mean, I talk about how, to this day, the most fascist-esque, the most susceptible to fascism classes are the lower middle and the rural. But that's not like they're that much less than us. The rest of us are barely more class conscious than them. It's like fractional. And of course, irony is the only people in America who have true class consciousness are the fucking rich. They are 100% aware of their class position and totally down with uniting together across competition within industries or whatever to maintain that power. So they're the only ones with class consciousness, which means that it's unlikely that in a crisis that I was talking about maybe happening last episode, they're not going to be really threatened by electoralism. They're going to be more threatened by just a general collapse. Or like breaking into like tribal warfare or something. So what I think would happen there's only one way the fascism truly comes back in America, and that is if this nascent left resurgence that we're talking about, that we've been talking about, that we're all part of in one way or another, if it really catches off in the next years, and you see a genuine left party emerge, as an alternative to the Democrats, or maybe less likely, but possibly gutting out the Democratic Party from within, like laying fucking eggs in its brain and then bursting forth and taking over its carcass. Either way, if you have a genuine left party in this country with mass membership, I mean, maybe not mass membership, or maybe we make it a membership org, who knows? With some sort of mass participation more than anything, and a real grip on people who are coming to terms with understanding themselves as workers, as against the rich, are organizing in their workplaces, are doing the sort of shit that they did before the Wagner Act and before the New Deal, the illegal organizing in the teeth of a hostile judiciary and governments, and make it happen and make it a threat, because it was the same situation in the 30s. You had this fermenting working class, and we might get that again. If we get that again before a terminal crisis, a genuine collapse of the economy, or the advanced ecological catastrophe of global warming coming to fruition, if that happens, while the left is genuinely making a political play, and there's still a political sphere, or we've recreated a political sphere, then yeah, you might see fascism become an electoral reality, and to take over government and replace it with reaction as we understand it now, the stable reaction, because fascism is in many ways the politicization, the political ideal of the death drive. It's the death drive turned into a political ideology. And so it hurtles towards annihilation, which is not the preferred mode of existence for conscious capitalists, But it is their unconscious urge. That's what's driving the whole thing, is an unconscious desire for that, which is why regular capitalism is going to lead to that same oblivion regardless, just a little later, just a little longer, because it's being driven by that unconscious urge. But consciously, you don't want to die. You want to keep going. You want to keep it stable. So that's why fascism is last resort only. And that would happen if the electoral left was a real threat at a point of crisis. But if the crisis comes before that time, I think what's going to happen is that the political and economic ruling classes will essentially collapse. They basically only still run things because of our lack of attention to them and because of the fact that they continue to deliver this basic, inflated Western standard of living, even if it's increasingly difficult for people, but it's at such a micro level and it's so insidious that it doesn't have the feeling of like direct oppression or exploitation the way that you would need for people to have that like snap of reality of what's being done to them. So as soon as that stops, as soon as they can't deliver anymore, their authority will completely collapse. And it won't require, there will be no political mechanism even to adjudicate it. It's not going to be done at the ballot box. Ballot boxes will cease to exist. So power will be seized and controlled directly by the one organization in America that is the most cohesive socially and internally, that is the best funded, and is the most respected and considered legitimate by the general population. That is the military. That is the U.S. military. Everything else, the bones of the state will dissolve, or the flesh of the state will dissolve, and leaving just the bones of the military. And even though you could argue that the military has been calling the shots for U.S. policy all across the board for years now, for decades, since World War II, probably, if you really want to take military Keynesianism seriously and basically make the tail wag the dog and say that the military was really calling the shots the whole time. All of this stuff was just to feed and maintain the military. Either way, the mask is going to drop. And either the military will make an actual seizure of power, or it will just reveal the power it's held the whole time. And the economy will be explicitly directed for the military and by the military. And the people left outside of it will essentially exist at their sufferance as sort of as support staff, as infrastructure, as like camp followers, basically. And it'll look kind of like Egypt or Pakistan, but obviously more Mad Max even than that. But just this the state where the military is the actual direct planner and architect of economic policy and everything. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope everybody who listened to the fascism episode the first time listens to this one, because I really think between those two, we've got a better understanding of it. Peace.